Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, August 16th, 2023, and today we're going to be talking about an election that is ramping up that is set to take place in just around 3 months in the state of Kentucky. A ruby red state that voted for President Trump in the last election by nearly 30 percentage points has an extremely competitive governor's race that will test the messaging for Democrats and Republicans as we head into the upcoming presidential election. Now, you might have been hearing a lot of information around the Kentucky governor's race, and again, that is because this is a contested race. Democrats currently have an incumbent, Governor Andy Beshear, who, although popular, is facing off in this competitive race against the Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, who is standing to be a head-to-head candidate for the Democrats in this race. Now, Kentucky, as you know, and I just showed you, is a red state. It was very difficult for Democrats to win it in the first place, and the circumstances that arose back in 2019 when Andy Beshear was first elected weren't necessarily and are not necessarily the same type of circumstances that are taking forth this November election. Now, we're going to be unpacking a lot of conversation around polling data within the state, around popularity for both of these candidates, around the 2019 election, and seeing if it's an indicator in any different way that might tell us a better understanding of how 2023 will go, looking back on our past and using that as a point of reflection. So, to start off, we're going to work backwards and move our way forwards and look at the 2019 race, when Andy Beshear defeated incumbent Republican Governor Matt Bevin by a margin of just 0.4% in this red state. This was a very competitive race, but one that Democrats weren't necessarily sure that they were going to win. The polling data back then had the Republicans actually winning this race by roughly 2 to 3 points. Also, 4 years prior to this had gone to the Republican Party, and 3 years prior had gone to Donald Trump by a margin of 30 percentage points. So, for it to be all of a sudden this battleground state 3 years later, Democrats weren't super hopeful, but obviously very happy when the results came in that Andy Beshear would go on to be the next governor of the state of Kentucky. Now, to give a bit more background and context around this race, like I said, it was a fluke election where nearly every possible circumstance benefited the Democratic Party in this race. For one, Andy Beshear is a legacy in the state. He has a political dynasty with his last name here that makes him well recognized. For instance, there's a reason why he's able to easily dominate in a primary on top of do well in a general election as a Democrat. This wouldn't just be any random Democrat. This is a Beshear, sort of similar to Bob Casey in the state of Pennsylvania, along the lines of a recognizable name that people have appreciation for and have voted for in years past. So you check off one box. You have a strong Democratic contender, but there are strong Democratic contenders everywhere. Joe Biden arguably was a strong Democratic contender, but not necessarily for the state of Kentucky. You see, Joe Biden only received 36% of the vote with roughly 700,000 votes. When Andy Beshear won in the state of Kentucky, he also received roughly 700,000 votes, but it was a much more lower turnout election and ultimately was enough to actually win. Donald Trump received over 1 million votes in this state. Now, on top of being a strong Democratic contender, there also had to be a weak GOP contender. This, again, is a state with a partisan lean of roughly Republican plus 30. So for all of these circumstances to be correct, number one, he had to be well recognizable. That's checked off the box. But two, the Republican was very unpopular. Matt Bevin, as the incumbent governor, had one of the lowest rating approval ratings in the entire country. When Morning Consult did their quarterly poll, they actually found that Matt Bevin was ranked the least popular governor in the entire nation 3 months before the election. So when you have news articles coming out, or 4 months, news articles coming out saying Matt Bevin is very unpopular, people hate him, and the voters, obviously responding to said poll, do in fact strongly dislike him as governor, they are going to vote against him. But the close result goes to show that approval rating isn't everything. One thing that we should keep in mind when we take a look at Governor Andy Beshear's approval rating as we go into analyzing the 2023 election. But if there's anything I want to take away from 2019, it is not that this race is indicative of much for Andy Beshear, except that he is a strong Democrat. When faced up against a weak GOP opponent with a year with an unpopular Republican president, Donald Trump being the case, you have the perfect storm and perfect circumstances for a Democratic victory. So how is it possible that the Democrats are now ahead in 2023? Well, one might argue that we are also in a circumstance where there is this perfect reality that Democrats have a very viable shot at winning re-election because of said reality, because of said perfect storm. Polling recently has shown that Governor Andy Beshear has been doing quite well amongst the average voter in the state of Kentucky. A recent poll from NBC News shows that Governor Beshear leads by 10 points against the Republican nominee, Governor or Attorney General Daniel Cameron within the state. Now, this 10-point victory, this 10-point lead for Governor Beshear is one that Democrats were very happy to see, but it's by no means realistic. Andy Beshear is not on track for a 10-point victory, and if he is to win re-election, it will have to be close, almost nearly as close, if not closer, than where it was in the last election. And that's because, again, Kentucky is this solid red state. It is really hard to crack voters here to make them move away from a party that they have voted for decades on the presidential, decades on the gubernatorial, decades on the senatorial, and even in the last election back in 2022, Rand Paul, a candidate who typically underperforms in Kentucky politics, won by 24 percentage points across the state of Kentucky, just underperforming Donald Trump by just 2%. Point being, Kentucky is not a competitive state. This 22-point victory, 24-point victory goes to show that even faced off against a bad Republican, Democrats don't exactly do that much better. It is, again, a necessary environment for a perfect storm to happen. But some Republicans would argue that this perfect storm simply isn't here. The reason why Governor Beshear is doing well is because people like him. His approval rating is through the roof. You can see that in terms of his overall position nationwide, that he is doing quite well. This lead here of 10 points is accompanied by a 63% job approval amongst this Republican state. 63% of voters, and this is consistent. I mean, poll after poll nationwide taken across all 50 states shows that Governor Beshear in his state as a Democratic governor is one of the most, if not the most popular Democratic governor in the United States, doing better than all of the Democrats in solid blue states, all of the swing state Democrats, and if he's not number one, he's number two. You rarely ever see him outside the top one or two, and that's because Andy Beshear is very much adored and respected in the state of Kentucky. But it doesn't always translate to votes. Again, keep in mind that Matt Bevin had a 35% approval rating when he won 48% of the vote in 2019. It was a very close race because partisanship, polarization are above all in today's America. And that will be the case in the state of Kentucky. So when his approval rating is 63%, there probably is a considerable portion of the population that will say, I approve of his job as governor, but it doesn't mean I would approve more of him more than a Republican. He might be doing a good job for a Democrat. He might be doing a good job, but a Republican would do a better one. That is what you might find from a considerable portion of these voters, which is why Democrats should still be very worried about this bid, but still, in many ways, optimistic. And we'll get into those points about why they should be optimistic. For starters, the polls are in a lot better position for Democrats than they were in 2019. Even though I'm not one to say that polls are the end-all be-all, I do think they provide us a general idea of where this race is going to go. And for a while, the Republicans haven't been able to even win in a singular poll. Even recently, they started to be down 8 points. Now, unfortunately, because Kentucky is not this super well, discussed state, not much national recognition about this governor's race, you really only find that candidates are the ones sourcing the polls. So amongst the recent ones, you have Andy Beshear, who sourced a recent poll that shows him up 8 points across the state. Then you have a Republican poll funded. When I say Republican and Democratic poll, I don't mean the institutes themselves that are doing the polling, but rather the sponsors. And thus, there is some type of inherent lean and benefit from the polling group to actually show some level of improvement for either side of the aisle. But even the Republican-led ones, even the one done by Daniel Cameron, the Republican nominee, shows Andy Beshear ahead by 2. The only one that shows a tie, not even a Republican victory, is Signal's poll done by in May of 2023. Months ago, that shows both candidates at 47-47. So you know already that this is going to be a close race, but the polls right now slightly benefit the Democratic Party. So there's about 2 things that we can see and look at here. Governor Andy Beshear is very popular, 63% approval rating, and then also keeping in mind his victory from 2019, you still have those check boxes, right? Well-recognizable Democrat, a popular Democrat at that point, so his approval rating is one thing, but it also is the polls are in a much better position. This is another thing, too, to keep in mind that the early indicators are saying, hey, the Democrats are doing quite well. And it isn't just the polls. It's also the forecasters. Race to the White House, which does a forecast in practically every important race, they show that Andy Beshear has a 72% chance of victory. I'm not one to think that he's going to have this landslide solid victory. They expect him to win by maybe 4 points across the state, but that's what happens when you are in a good position. That's what happens when you are a popular governor. A 4-point victory in a red state would be quite impressive for Andy Beshear, to say the least. Now, I've mentioned Governor Beshear's approval rating being 63%, but it also is to say that there are approval ratings taken of statewide officials. And it matters because his Republican opponent isn't just some, run-of-the-mill standard Republican. It's Attorney General Daniel Cameron, who served alongside Governor Matt Bevin and was very closely associated with the scandal that brought down Governor Bevin when he was running for office back in 2019. And with that, and with the campaign that the Beshear campaign has been running against Daniel Cameron, his approval rating has taken a significant hit. A year ago, Daniel Cameron was favored by the Kentucky voters. He was a Republican attorney general, he was hard on crime, he was well recognizable, a huge supporter of President Trump, and voters loved him. But then came in the attacks, then came in the association with Governor Bevin, and it continues to tank his favorability rating. Amongst the same poll of people that disapprove of Joe Biden, 65 to 28 are the same people that disapprove of Daniel Cameron, 44 to 42. It's a lot closer, but keep in mind, again, this is a Republican plus 30 state. This isn't some circumstance where it's Florida or North Carolina or another battleground state that might lean red, where there should be some type of benefit for Republicans. No, this is a red state, and yet their incumbent attorney general is disapproved of by 2 points nationwide, where their Democratic governor is approved of ahead nationwide. I mean, that is where you find, not nationwide, statewide. 41% of these respondents have a very favorable view of Andy Beshear. That is higher than the total approve for President Joe Biden. You only find that just 40% of the public in the state of Kentucky disapproves of Andy Beshear's job. 40% in a state where Donald Trump is getting 62 to 65% of the vote, and where Donald Trump amongst the electorate here, you are finding is getting 54% on his side, viewing him favorably. The takeaway from this that I get is that Governor Beshear has a similar approval rating to President Donald Trump. Isn't that interesting? Not only is it similar, it is in fact identical. Identical in the sense you have Donald Trump. In fact, actually, it might be worse. 54%. No, I'm reading this number wrong. 54% for Donald Trump. 56% for Governor Beshear. So that actually proves my point even further. So we take all of this in consideration and we see that you have an unpopular Republican, a popular Democrat who's outperforming the former president who just won in the state by a solid amount, who won in 2019 and has a proven electoral track record, whether his family or himself, and the polls are in his favor. That's why this isn't too far from being believable. And that's why Republicans very well could lose this state that should have been a slam dunk. Given that we're not working under an unpopular Republican president, but rather under an unpopular Democratic president, given that there is a lot of energy on the Republican side for Daniel Cameron compared to Matt Bevin, I mean, the difference is night and day. They're inspired by Daniel Cameron. They were never inspired by Matt Bevin, yet Andy Beshear inspires voters more. And the final thing that I want you to take away from this is something that we have talked about very heavily in relation to the midterm elections previously and the upcoming presidential, and that is the issue of abortion. And you might be thinking, for a state that overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump, nearly 30 points in the last election, obviously this is a pro-life state. And maybe you're right in sentiment. But in terms of actual turnout, in terms of voting, Kentucky voters rejected an anti-abortion ballot measure by 5 percentage points in the last election. 5 percentage points in a state that Donald Trump won by 30. Just the sheer amount of Republicans that crossed over to vote for this anti-abortion ballot measure to say, you know what, we reject this, to vote no on this measure is astounding. This election took place alongside the 2022 midterms. This article was written November 9th, 2022, the same time that we saw the results come in the Kentucky Senate race. The Republicans won by 24 points. The House delegation, when it came down to Kentucky, you can see here, was overwhelmingly conservative. Just one singular Democratic county and Republicans dominated elsewhere. So where did the support come from? Again, from Republicans. And when you have Republicans campaigning heavily, for example, Daniel Cameron, who has been very open about his pro-life stance, very open that if he was governor, he would intend to enforce and declare significant restrictions on the issue of abortion. That is where voters are going to start thinking again, why did I vote this way? And consider that when they vote in 2022. We talked about this perfect storm. Republicans are convinced that the perfect storm isn't happening. They are convinced that Daniel Cameron is a representation of the new Republican Party. But as we have seen in 2019 and as we will likely see in 2023, The circumstances of this race are eerily similar to ones of the last one. And although it may not have seemed like that at surface level, when you take a look at approval, right? When you take a look at polling, when you take a look at punditry, when you take a look at history, you start to see the results come into play. You start to see how this connects to this, connects to this, connects to this, connects to this, and connects to a Democratic victory, and connects to how Democrats can win in the future, even in solid red states. Not to say that this strategy can be taken on to the presidential. No chance in hell the Democrats win Kentucky in 2024. But it is to say that just the bits of here that worked now can work in the future, will work in the future, and in these one-off cases where you have that perfect storm, Democrats can be in a strong chance for election, in this case, re-election. Not to say that there isn't a chance for Daniel Cameron at all. He has a very solid one, but it's not likely. And that's absolutely insane to think about for a state that's voted overwhelmingly for Republicans in the past few decades alone. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.